Ranjan Adiga was born and raised in Nepal. He teaches English literature and creative writing here at Westminster. He is also a published fiction writer whose stories have appeared in Story Quarterly and Belmont Review, among other journals. His work focuses on the immigrant experience, and in addition, he partners with Promise South Salt Lake on a summer writing workshop focused on immigrant children and the power of storytelling. Now, if you would, please welcome Ranjan Adiga.
Thanks, CK. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? So I've never thought of myself as a big thinker, so CK, thank you. Well, thank you for coming again. The title of my talk tonight is I'm Not a Third World Person. So as CK said, I was born and raised in Nepal, a third world country. We're very small. We're very hard to point on a map because we're sandwiched between India and China. Growing up, I didn't think of our country as third world. Sure, we had problems, pothole streets, constant power outages, corrupt governments, but we also had a rich culture, beautiful mountains, and dynamic people working to provide for their families. I first became aware of being a third world person when I traveled outside the country. As soon as I presented my Nepalese passport to immigration in Singapore, I was pulled aside and taken to a small room with multiple CCTV cameras. My bag was searched, every item examined with gloved hands. There were about a dozen of us in the crammed room, brown and black, secretly wishing we had better passports. When nothing suspicious was found, they finally let us enter their country. Then there was this time in the US when my white Australian roommate on campus complained to the International Student Office about feeling uncomfortable living with someone from another part of the world. He said I seemed like a nice guy, but the culture clash put unnecessary stress on him. And the staff was put in an awkward position. They assured me that the student's intentions weren't bad. He wasn't a bad person. And that the student kept reminding me that he liked me and it had nothing to do with me as a person. He was eventually moved into a room with a Danish roommate, and I got a Guatemalan roommate. The invisible divide between first and third world was very visible if you knew what you were looking at. The term third world was first coined by the French historian Alfred Sauvé when the Cold War had just started and loyalties were split between two camps, the US and its Western allies and the communist Soviet bloc. Non-aligned nations became the third world, most of whom were former colonies of European powers. So the hierarchical setup was political, meaning it was based on political affiliations, which also meant it was about the economy. Third world countries, having just come out of colonial rule, with no political alignments with the West, had mostly non-industrial economies. Over time, third world became a shorthand for poor, brown, and black. And here's the funny thing. No one thinks of Switzerland, also a non-aligned nation, as third world, or South Africa, a Western ally, as first world, although, going by the original definition, they are just that. And first and third worlds aren't just about the economy either. When Donald Trump complains about people from shithole countries coming into the US, he's not speaking of Hungary, whose GDP per capita is half of that of Nigeria. He's not talking about New Zealand, whose global trade economy is 10 times smaller than India's. He's giving voice to a feeling of many, however implicit, that immigrants are welcome as long as they're not from shithole countries, coded language for brown and black. So when my students casually use the term third world, it kind of bothers me. Although third world sounds a lot better than shithole. But what else are they going to call it if not third world? Developing world? Well, how do we define developed and developing? For one, developed implies an arrogance, as if there's no room left for improvement. The US has the highest number of gun-related deaths anywhere in the world, highest rate of obesity, most expensive healthcare, and according to the United Nations, ranks 58th in education spending per capita. The gap between the wealthy and poor is so huge in the US that Harvard professor Paul Farmer calls the deep pockets of American poverty the fourth world. Spaces that are not bound by geography. Spaces so invisible they blend into the first world and you wouldn't even know that they exist. And you may also have heard of the Global South, a term coined by the World Bank to refer to lower income nations. But Global South is it's vague and it's geographically inaccurate. So, for example, Australia and New Zealand are in the Global South, meaning the southern hemisphere, and they're considered first world. While countries like Ethiopia and Algeria, traditionally referred to as third world, are situated in the global north. So if we shouldn't call them the third world, or developing countries, or the global south, what should we call these countries? Any ideas? Who said that? There you go. That's what I have. So I'm not sure I have all of the answers or even an answer, but we do know that countries, like people, have names. So how about just calling them by their name, like Egypt or Vietnam? Or if we're referring to a group of countries in a region, we could say Northern Africa or East Asia. Naming countries by their names and geography will force us to look at a map. Something Americans are not very good at doing. At the very least, it'll avoid reducing entire nations to a single narrative. Now, let me not get too carried away either. I enjoy a lot of benefits today. I'm fairly settled with a job, a house, and the undeniable privilege that comes from being a professor. But I still remember that time in Singapore when we were treated like third world people. When I first came to the US, I started being recognized as an international student. After I got a job in the US, I became an immigrant. Now that I live here, they call me a person of color. Okay? Each time I've moved farther away from Nepal, the label used on me has become less offensive. Now, person of color sounds like I've joined a special club that makes up the American dream. Part of me is flattered, but that could quickly change when I step inside an airport or even a grocery store. And there are millions of people from so-called third world countries stranded at a random airport right now, or holding a failed job application because they're not shielded by their educational degree or social class, as I am. When we label a country as third world, we imply that the people are also third world, inferior and dirty. And she doesn't look inferior, does she? People lose the battle of perception before they're given a chance. Now, the funny thing is, during my recent visit to Nepal last summer, I heard a local politician on TV call Bhutanese people third world migrants. I was scratching my head thinking, when did we start calling other countries third world? But I guess that's how it works. We internalize it and spew it on those that we think are less than us. We intentionally say third world to demean others, or say it unintentionally because the language is so ingrained in our cultures. Like the other day, I heard Bernie Sanders rally up his supporters by saying, without universal health care, America is like a third world country. The crowd cheered him on. He's kind of right, but he's also kind of very wrong. Thank you.